You're listening to Storytime in Paris on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and to join our book club, please join us on Patreon. Since well before Victor Hugo looked up at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Authors have been inspired by Paris. Welcome to the Storytime in Paris podcast on Paris Underground Radio, where we keep that tradition alive by showcasing an author with a French connection in each episode. Every episode will feature 5 questions asked by you, our author's biggest fans, and answered live on air. Then our authors will treat us to a reading of an excerpt from their book. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. Would you like to join the Storytime in Paris book club? Head on over to patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio and stay tuned to the end of this episode for more information. Welcome to the Season 6 finale of Storytime in Paris. I have some good news and some bad news, but don't worry, the good vastly outweighs the bad. After 65 episodes, I'm going to be taking the next season off. But never fear, I'll be back in 2024 with a brand new season, and I'll have some bonus episodes for you coming up this fall, so you'll barely notice I'm gone. In the meantime, I'll be focusing on my newest venture, a podcast called City of Muses. City of Muses is heavily inspired by this podcast and features conversations with artists and creatives about where their creativity springs from, where they find inspiration, how and why they feel compelled to share the messages they do, and how the city of Paris plays into it all. Thank you to all of you who have listened to Season 1 of City of Muses. I have interviewed visual artists, stained glass artists, cabaret dancers, singers, performance artists, tattoo artists, map makers, fashion designers, and more. I've fallen completely in love with the show. It turns out that there are few things better than speaking to artists about how and why they create. So I'll be back with Season 2 of City of Muses in the fall. I hope you'll join me there. For my second, even bigger bit of good news, I'm thrilled to share that New York Times, USA Today, and internationally best-selling author Madeline Martin is our season finale guest. And, even better, I'll be sharing a sneak peek of her latest book, The Keeper of Hidden Books, which is due to be released on August 1st. The Keeper of Hidden Books is based on a true story of the underground library in World War II Warsaw, Poland. Zofia is an intelligent, outspoken, and rebellious 17-year-old who wants nothing more than to dig into a good book and chat about it with her Jewish best friend Janina. She's wholly unprepared for the horrors that the Nazi occupation brings, but is determined to do anything she can to protect those she loves most. The Keeper of Hidden Books is a beautiful book that made me cry with the hope it radiates. Without further ado, please allow me to introduce Madeline Martin, author of The Keeper of Hidden Books. Hello, Madeline. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
It is such an honor to have been able to read an advance copy of this book because I loved it.
Thank you.
And I'm very excited to be able to share it with our listeners. But before we get to all of that, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes, so I'm Madeline Martin. I am a total history nerd. I live in St. Augustine, Florida, and I write historical fiction, World War II historical fiction. I very much have a books about books kind of a theme going on because, I'm a diehard reader. I always have been. And I can't imagine my life without books. So my characters kind of fall into that same category. And I had written historical romance beforehand, medieval, Regency, and everything kind of in between. So I have about 30 romances out as well. And I have cats and kids.
In that order.
And that's pretty much me in a nutshell. Yeah.
Fantastic. And do you have a connection to Paris or to France?
So as an Army brat, I lived in Germany for about 12 years. And so I have visited Paris. I have visited a couple of times. And I actually was in Lyon, France a couple years ago while doing research for The Librarian Spy, because one of the characters was in Lyon, which was the capital of the French resistance during World War II. So that's another thing about me too, is I do love to travel for my books to make sure I get all of that rich detail.
Can you tell us a little bit about The Keeper of Hidden Books?
Yes. So The Keeper of Hidden Books is really about what happens in Poland during World War II. I just didn't feel like it was a super explored topic. And it was something that I personally wanted to know about, especially with my family being Polish. And so, I ended up uncovering this amazing story about the real Warsaw public librarians during World War II and how they were saving books from Nazi destruction, how they were opening private little secret libraries when all of the libraries were closed. And so really this book is about the efforts that these people went through to not only save people, but also to save books.
It's a fascinating book. And all of these different iterations that the libraries go through and how they evolve and pop up in secret places all throughout the book. It's fascinating.
Thank you.
Very, very interesting.
The research was amazing.
Well, let's talk about that. So you mentioned it a little bit in the epilogue, but for our listeners, can you talk a little bit about the research you did and maybe some of the challenges that you came upon?
Yeah, absolutely. So I love to read nonfiction books because like I said, I'm a history nerd and a research nerd. So I had like about 100 nonfiction books, a little bit more than that I had actually used for this particular book that I was writing. But I also got to go to Warsaw for 2 weeks for research. And whenever I travel for research, there's always a family member who wants to tag along. And as soon as my mom found out that I was going to Poland, she said, "Oh, dibs." So she came with me and she was a trooper. I mean, when I go for research, I probably walk anywhere between 20,000 to 25,000 steps a day.
Wow.
I spend hours and hours, sometimes days in museums. In fact, when I was in Lyon, I was at the Resistance Museum for so long that the security guards started to follow me around. So I definitely spend a lot of time. And I had this amazing tour guide in Warsaw who took us on tours that ranged from 8 hours to 16 hours.
Wow.
And my mom hung in there the entire time. So, one of the biggest challenges is, first of all, with all of that amazing information that I uncovered, I filled up about 15 notebooks with handwritten notes. And so taking that and trying to really figure out what can I put into the book, what really needs to be left out, that's hard. But I think that one of the biggest challenges that I faced, aside from it just not being in English, is with the Soviet occupation. So after the Nazis took over Poland, the Soviets actually had really kind of controlled it until around 1990, which I don't think a lot of people realize. So when I went back and I was doing my research, I couldn't go with any books that were written in Poland during that time because they would have been censored by the Soviet Union. So I had to make sure that my reading materials came from publications that were done in England and America and things like that.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
So to find the sources and then to make sure that the sources are verifiable.
And not censored. Yeah. It's crazy. I haven't had to deal with that so far with my research until this book. So, but learning that early on was like, oh, that's really important. Okay.
And how long is this process? If you're reading 100 books nonfiction and then you fill up 15 notebooks, how long does it take from that point until the finished product?
It takes about a year. That's usually about 10 months worth of research and then about like a month and a half of like really getting everything plotted out, because I don't actually make the characters even until I've done all of the research. Because somebody who has grown up with an environment in Poland is going to be vastly different than someone who's had an environment that they've grown up with a history in France, in every single country. So I feel like I really need to explore the country, not just in World War II, but its entire history, really, to get a feel for who this character is. And so then I spend about, a month and a half creating the characters and the plot. And then I have like a month and a half of frantic writing where I'm like, oh my gosh, my deadline is approaching, which is actually where I am right now with the book I'm working on.
Well, thank you for taking time out of that frenzy.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
That still seems like it's pretty fast, though, after all that research, just to cull away everything that needs to be culled away. I feel like that could take a long time.
Yeah, I think because I spend like 10 months really immersed in it, I feel like it's in my brain, which, I will say with researching Poland got a little heavy sometimes because, it was the Nazi occupation was incredibly cruel and aggressive and the horrible things that they did. So, and I don't want to omit atrocities from my books, but I also tried to not be gratuitous with them either. And so if there's ever anything that I read that I can't get out of my head because it keeps me up at night, I try not to put those kind of things into my books.
Interesting. I'm going to come back to that in a little while because I have a question about that. But before we get to that, I want to talk about Zofia. So Zofia is our main character. She has this really good group of girlfriends in the beginning and a very, very best friend whose name is either Janina or Janina. How do I say that?
I think it's actually pronounced Janina.
Janina. Okay, thank you.
That's how I've been pronouncing it, at least.
I wasn't sure. Yeah, okay, so Janina. If I'm not mistaken, at the beginning of the book, they're all 17 years old?
Correct, yes.
So why did you decide to give us a 17-year-old girl as a main character?
So really, when the Warsaw Uprising happened, which this is kind of answering your question like 5 years later. So the Warsaw Uprising happened in 1944. And most of the people who were in the Warsaw Uprising were around the age of 21 and 22, if not younger. Because the older ones oftentimes were already doing other things, like they were involved in active sabotage, or they'd been sent to labor camps, or they'd been sent to munitions factories. They really were already sent away doing other things. So I wanted her to really be active in like the Girl Guides, in the Gray Ranks, which is it's sort of like Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts go to war, I guess. Really, it was sort of like a subsidiary of the Home Army, the Polish Home Army. And so I wanted her to be part of that. And, I have to say it was kind of a challenge starting off with a 17-year-old character because, well, teenagers can be very moody. And that can be kind of hard to read sometimes. Like, I love reading YA. And when I read YA, sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, this character is so annoying. and then I realize, but they're a teenager. And honestly, like, that's just kind of, par for the course. So it was very hard. I wanted to make a careful balance where she still seemed like a teenager, but she wasn't like obnoxiously a teenager, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you struck a good balance there.
Thank you.
One of the things that I love the most about this book is that it is an emotional book. She's a very emotional character, but not necessarily in the way that you would expect in a book about Nazi-occupied Poland.
Right.
She's very passionate and angry and rebellious and headstrong and hopeful as well.
Thank you.
Was it difficult to create these characters and these feelings within her against the backdrop of the atrocities that happen around her?
So the backdrop is actually kind of what created her character. Kind of like what I was saying, how I really use the history of the country to create the character that I want to have. And when I was reading about the fact that, Poland had been was under Russian control for 123 years. They didn't actually receive their independence until just after the Great War with the Treaty of Versailles in 1918. So they had just celebrated 20 years of independence when the Nazis came in. So these generations before had been fighting and dying for freedom. And Zofia was this, and all of the girls that were her age, they were born in this like almost bubble of freedom. And so if you imagine the ferocity of these people who have fought for so long, and so these kids, even though they're grown up in freedom, they've been hearing about all of these amazing heroes and these amazing things that they've done to have a free Poland finally. And so I thought, you know what, if somebody came in, how would she be? And I thought, she's going to be feisty. She's going to be rebellious, and she's going to be strong. And I usually don't have rebellious, feisty heroines. I always have strong heroines, but not necessarily with so much grit. But it made sense for this particular history of Poland and what they're encountering for her to really be like that.
I think that's what I appreciated about it so much. I don't know much about, or didn't know much about Poland during this period of time, or actually I don't know much about Polish history in general. And so it was very interesting to learn all about that and to have a main character who was so feisty and headstrong and, like outspoken in times where you really would rather her stop talking.
Yeah. And that's exactly who she is, and I felt like I had to be true to who she was and true to her character.
Does French culture sometimes leave you scratching your head? Well, you might enjoy listening to our sister podcast, Navigating the French, hosted by journalist Emily Monaco. Each episode focuses on a different word in the French language, and Emily is joined by an expert who will help explore what that word says about French culture. Listen now to Navigating the French on ParisUndergroundRadio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. Zofia was a nice ward for the book. Like, she was a fun person to follow along with in the midst of all of these awful things that are happening to her and around her. And it's a book about war and it's a book about horrors and atrocities, but we don't linger there. Like you said, we don't spend a lot of time. The book is never heavy or depressing, and it did make me cry, but it made me cry because it was so beautiful, not because it was so heavy. Well, no, thank you.
Oh, I really do appreciate it. Thank you.
Was this a difficult balance to strike? Did you find yourself struggling here, or did it come naturally?
Oh, absolutely. It's very, very difficult. I mean, honestly, when I was doing research for this book, I kind of fell into a little bit of a spiral of depression because the research is very, very heavy and it's very painful. Just the horrible things that people do to one another. It just really is awful to read. But, I didn't want this to be a depressing book. And I also wanted to really showcase the heroism and the incredible fighting spirit of the Poles during World War II. And so really that was my aim, to show that focus of no matter how many times they got knocked down, they always came back up. And so that was really the primary focus, not just with the war in general, but even like with trying to maintain their culture, what they did to make sure that people still had access to Polish literature, that this Polish literature from centuries wasn't going to be lost forever because of just Nazis being careless and looting and everything else. And so that was very, very important to me, which was why the focus wasn't on the awful things that they did, that the Nazis did. We all know they've done horrible things. My focus was on the strength and the pride and the bravery.
Yeah, and that really comes through. I appreciated that because, like you said, we know these horrible things happen. And in the book, people die, obviously, people around the main character. Like, it's a book set in war, set with the Nazis. And it's a hard read in that way, just because these are awful things that truly happen. Right. But it wasn't until the epilogue where I really read the numbers and the statistics that it hit home how profound of a loss this really was for the country.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a book club in the book.
Yes. A secret book club.
A secret book club, which I love.
Thank you.
How did you decide on which specific books to include, and did those books change?
So yes and yes. So it took there was a lot of research involved. And, to be honest with you, I tried so hard to be accurate in the fact that the books would have been translated into Polish by that time. But unfortunately, that research also really got a little bit bigger than I can control. So I was like, I think this is probably, for the most part, going to be okay. But also, a lot of the books actually came from my research. One of the biggest books that constantly was mentioned was Gone with the Wind, because it had just come out in America, I think a decade before or something like that, or maybe not even, maybe 5 years. But it had already been translated into Polish because it was mentioned so many times by people when I was reading through my research. And War and Peace was the number one book of all of the books that I saw that was referenced many times over. And, I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that, with War and Peace, I don't think I'm giving any spoilers away here, with the whole sort of thing with Napoleon and Napoleon's downfall and really, Russia's involvement in that. And with Poland, with the Soviet Union, which was the Soviet Union after World War I, which is why I'm saying Russia versus Soviet Union. But which, by the way, that's another kind of fine line you always have to be careful of with writing historicals. But, this, with Poland, they kind of were looking to Russia, what can Russia do to help us? Even though at one point in the very beginning of the war, Poland was pretty much divided between Russia and Germany. But it's kind of the better the devil you know. So War and Peace showed this despot, essentially, who has their downfall, even though they seem like they're completely undefeatable, and Russia is there, kind of taking them down. And so they really looked at that book with hope. So trying to choose all of these books, some of them were just really interesting books that I enjoyed, like with Kafka's Metamorphosis. That's just a fascinating book. And then I really love Les Miserables. I had recently read it by Victor Hugo. And I was like, oh, this book touched my soul. And so I had to put that in there as well. And so some of them really were very poignant to the plot. For example, I think probably the one that was the most profound for me for the plot was All Quiet on the Western Front. So, and you'll see why when you read the book. But yeah, so it was really careful, trying to choose which ones. And it did change because some of them I realized, some of them got a little bit complicated. Like when I started to delve too deeply into the book and into the plot, I'm like, oh, this kind of introduces a new topic that just kind of spirals the plot out of a way I don't want it to go. And so I had to be very careful about cultivating that list.
It was interesting reading their reactions to the different books in the book club, especially something like Metamorphosis, and how they relate what's happening in their own worlds to what's happening in the book. It's very interesting. It's an interesting plot device.
Thank you.
But I was very surprised by War and Peace and Gone with the Wind. I think Gone with the Wind is such a weird choice, but it makes sense.
Yeah, it was just such a hugely popular book then. And, I have my own conflicted feelings about, Gone with the Wind just because of the racial aspects of it. But it's almost impossible to talk about books and having a reader in World War II and not have it come up. That'd be like somebody writing a book set now and nobody mentioning Colleen Hoover, even though they're like working in a bookstore or something. Do you know what I mean? Like It was that big.
Well, and it's a good escape too. If you're going through all of these things, it's a nice escapist book.
Absolutely.
Did you read all of the books that were in the book club?
Yes. So either I had read them or they were ones that I have read like in the past, or I read them while I was writing the book, and I'm like, oh, this sounds like this would be a good one. Let me read it to make sure. So yeah, thankfully Audible helps out with that because it's hard to always find time, especially with 2 kids and just kind of being busy with that and everything. I can listen to a lot of the books.
I'm a huge fan of audiobooks.
Same.
I have a dog, so every time when I walk my dog, I listen to a book so that I don't get frustrated with the fact that she needs to sniff literally everything that we pass.
That's funny. Now, do you listen in French or do you listen in English?
Oh, I'm lazy. I listen in English.
I get that.
I listen in English. I should listen in French. I know. Now I feel ashamed.
No, I'm going to call you out.
So I have a bonus question for you.
Okay.
If you were going to recommend a book that's been on a banned book list to our readers, what book would you suggest they start with?
I have to say, honestly, All Quiet on the Western Front, just because, and then that was on like the German banned book, but I felt like it was such a very poignant portrayal of war. It is very like raw and uncut and like almost to the point that it's shocking, but it really does show the humanity behind everything that soldiers really face. And I feel like if you've never been a soldier, it's like you have to let yourself see that part of it to really truly appreciate what others have paid for so that you can have the freedom that you have.
Yeah, well said.
Thank you.
Do you have a calico cat?
I do have a calico cat.
Okay.
Yeah, she has a big spot on her face. And so we named her Ink, and we figured it's like the perfect author's cat. And then I have one more cat, and he's all black, and he has a little crook in his tail. So when he sits, it makes like a perfect curly cue. He's so cute.
So I think it would be really fabulous if you could read a little bit to us from The Keeper of Hidden Books.
All right. So I'm just going to start at the beginning. Warsaw, Poland, August 1939. Zofia Novak sat back on her calves in the warm summer grass while her friend Janina clumsily wound a bandage around her head. The other pairs of girl guides sat in a semicircle beneath the oak trees in Lizinski Park, all working to perfect their first aid skills. Not that the looming war on Poland would ever come to Warsaw. Still, it was wise to be ready, and everyone in the city was preparing in their own particular way. For Papa, it was stocking medical supplies at the hospital, while Zofia's mother waited in endless grocers' lines to ensure their cabinets were overflowing with tinned food. Posters were plastered all over the city, asking men to line up at elementary schools and enlist, and radio stations filled the air with the pulse of patriotic music. And it was why Helen Keller's The Story of My Life was nestled in Zofia's bag, another read inspired by the list of books Hitler had banned in Germany. Zofia pulled the bandage from her head and repurposed the linen to bind a splint on Janina's lower leg. How's that? It feels good. Janina wriggled her limb. Studying medicine like your father might be a good choice for next year. Rather than reply, Zofia considered her handiwork. Have you decided what you want to do after our final exams? Janina's voice was gentle as she spoke, but nothing could lighten the pressing decision that weighed on Zofia every day. This was their last year of secondary school, a final exam away from graduating. They would be 18 then, adults. The whole world stretched out ahead of them like a runway so they could soar into the future, for everyone except her. You sound like Madka, Zofia groused. Though it wasn't really true. Janina's characteristic delicacy was nowhere near the brusque tone of Zofia's mother. Whether she was insisting Zofia dress nicer, be more outgoing, or be more proactive in choosing a career path, something lucrative like medicine, there was always a demeaning air about her mother, which was precisely why Zofia referred to her in the more formal regard as Matka rather than Mama. Janina's mother was a mama, the type to smile and ask after a test or to offer hugs on a bad day rather than criticism. Perhaps that was why Janina was always so kind and considerate. It was that congeniality that started their friendship so many years ago when they were children. Zofia had never been gregarious, more the kind to keep to herself and tuck into a book than drum up conversation with people she didn't know. Being the tallest in class did her no favors, leaving her feeling as though she stuck out like an ugly duckling among baby chicks. On Janina's first day in school, she'd strode over to Zofia with an enviable confidence and shared some of the flower-shaped butter cookies her mother had baked, filling any silence between them with an animated chatter that made Zofia instantly like her. Now Janina moved her leg, testing Zofia's bandage. If I sound like Madka, then I take back my suggestion. The loosely tied bandage gave, and the neat knot slipped free, the band unraveling from her leg. One of the splints tilted over into the grass. Being in medicine is not my path, evidently. Zofia collected the splint with what she hoped was an uncaring smile. I think Papa understands. Her father was a renowned doctor in Warsaw, specializing in surgeries. His was a name that would be impossible to live up to, especially for a daughter who couldn't commit to any kind of future. You love to read. Janina blew a lock of dark hair out of her brown eyes. Maybe you could study literature. She gasped in excitement and sat up straighter. Perhaps you could become an author like Marta Krakowska. It sounded ridiculous, even when Janina said it with such sincerity. While Zofia had no idea what she wanted to do, she did know she was no Marta Krakowska. The author penned epic tales of romance featuring lovers who met amid strife and war. Every story was better than the last, each ending in a contented happiness for the couple and a little calico cat. But Zofia didn't believe in romance. She didn't have the lyrical voice of Krakowska. She was no author, to be sure. Zofia pulled another splint from Zofia's leg and wound the bandage into a neat ball. Did you read The Story of My Life yet? Janina's eyes lit up. I did. What an incredible... No. A voice called out from the pair beside them. Their friend Maria shook her head, her blonde curls swaying, her arm extended toward her guide partner who had it wrapped partially to the elbow. You can't talk about the book right now when I can barely hear you. At the library, then. Janina turned her attention back to Zofia with a mischievous glint in her eye. But you clearly want to change the subject, so let's turn to something more pleasant. Like how much you're looking forward to school tomorrow. Zofia groaned, and Maria turned away with a quiet smile. Math was tediously dull, the series of numbers lacking any real challenge. Government was drier than the dust gathering on her own open textbooks from last year. Even art was awful. While Zofia appreciated the beauty of it, the medium of their application was of little interest to her. Oh, and how she hated being subjected to the mediocrity of her own limited skills when forced to try her hand. On and on it went with every class, each one more lackluster than the last. Except literature. She did enjoy that subject. At least at university, her courses would be tailored to her future endeavors, whatever they might be. Their Girl Guide captain, Christina, clapped her hands to get their attention, sparing Janina a sarcastic reply from Zofia about just how much she was not looking forward to school tomorrow. Great job today, guides! Christina looked around the circle of paired-off girls, her head lifted with satisfaction. War with Germany is coming, and Poland must be ready. At least the Girl Guides definitely are. Warmth effused Zofia's chest at the words. The Girl Guides was a scouting organization meant to prepare girls and young women for life with social skills, philanthropic ideals, and the ability to offer aid to the public in whatever form was needed. If Germany did attack, the Girl Guides' efforts would help Poland. Zofia was part of the generation of Poles born in a free state after regaining its sovereignty during the Treaty of Versailles. It was something Poland had fought for more than 120 years to obtain. From their earliest days, they were fed tales of heroism and bravery until their eyes burned bright with patriotism and their hearts thumped with Polish pride. Theirs might be a country young in her independence, having only just celebrated 20 years, but she was ready to cut her teeth on victory, something the Germans would likely soon learn.
If you're enjoying this podcast, you may also enjoy my podcast, City of Muses, which is brand new to the Paris Underground Radio Network. Each week, I chat with contemporary artists, poets, dancers, designers, and performers to explore what inspires them, where their creativity comes from, and how Paris has helped or hindered their dreams come true. Inspiration and creativity meet in Paris, the City of Muses. Check out City of Muses now, available wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. Fabulous. Thank you. But it made me think of something. You said that you traveled to Poland with your mom.
Yes.
Did you know that the relationship between Zofia and her mom would be such a plot point when you started writing?
No, in fact, I wanted to make sure I specified in the author's note that I have a lovely relationship with my mother because, for some reason, I wanted Zofia to definitely have some sort of conflict on the page, but I wanted it to be a realistic sort of conflict, and I wanted it to be something that the person also sort of learned from. So, Matka really actually has her own character arc through this book. And that really comes into play with that relationship, which is why it was so important for it to be with her mother.
Excellent. So normally I ask, what's next for you? You're working on another book at the moment, right?
Correct. Yes. I have a name for it, but it hasn't been officially put out there yet. So I don't think I'm allowed to say it. But I will say that I'm going back to England again, like with the last bookshop in London. And this book will take place in Nottingham, England. And it is going to also be about books in some capacity. I can't help myself.
And when does The Keeper of Hidden Books come out?
This comes out August 1st. And there's a reason why that date is so incredibly wonderful to me. So August 1st was the date of the Warsaw Uprising at 5 p.m., which was W hour. And so that was the day where, after all of this oppression and cruelty and hate, the Poles finally had the opportunity to rise up against the Nazis and fight back and try to take over their city. And it was a battle that lasted almost 2 months. And so to this day in Warsaw, at 5 p.m. on August 1st, the entire city goes completely silent, except for all the alarms and everything blaring. So having this book come out on August 1st really is just so incredibly special to me.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is incredible.
Thank you.
So where can people find you if they want to keep up to date with what's going on in your world?
Well, my website, MadelineMartin.com, or on Twitter and Instagram, I'm at Madeline M. Martin because somebody already grabbed Madeline Martin. And then on Facebook, I believe it's Madeline Martin Author.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Madeline. It was so wonderful to speak to you. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me, Jennifer. I really appreciate it. This was so fun being in Paris with you.
Thank you again to Madeline Martin for being such an excellent season finale guest. You can find Madeline on Instagram and Twitter at Madeline M. Martin, on Facebook at Madeline Martin Author, and on her website, MadelineMartin.com. Gigantic thanks to you for listening this season. This podcast brings me so much joy. As I mentioned, I'll be taking a short break to concentrate on my newest podcast, City of Muses, available on all platforms, which I encourage you to check out. You can learn more about it on our website, parisundergroundradio.com/City of Muses. I'll also be quite active over on Patreon, where you'll find behind-the-scenes looks at life in Paris and into some of the exhibits and events happening here. You'll also get access to our book club, where I invite guests who have been on the podcast to come speak with us, and you can speak to them directly and delve even deeper into the secrets we couldn't spoil here on this podcast. To join the Patreon, please go to patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio. You can keep up to date with everything that's happening all over Paris Underground Radio by subscribing to our newsletter, which comes out every Sunday. And you can subscribe on parisundergroundradio.com/newsletter, where you can also check out some of the past issues. If you are enjoying Storytime in Paris, please don't forget to rate and review it wherever you listen to podcasts. It's the fastest and easiest way to support me and this show. Please also spread the word to any people you know who also love to read. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity, and you can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JENNYPHORIA. Thank you again, and until season 7, happy reading! This episode of Storytime in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.